Okay, well, very pleased to have Ellen Baumler back again. She did part 1 last year and part 2 this year. Yeah, I don't know if there's a part 3 or not, but we'll see. And she is also an award-winning author, because the Beyond Spirit Tailings won an award of merit from the American Association for State and Local History last year. Yes.
Thank you very much. I'm going to get comfortable here. I think you all can hear me just fine, can you? And does anyone mind if I sit down?
Do you want to move your chairs?
Yeah, I was going to say it's a little bit, then I'll mess up the camera there. Am I okay? Okay. Well, people always ask me, how did a professional historian go down this rather weird path? And so I usually like to start by explaining that. We came to Helena in 1988. My daughter, who's sitting back there, and my husband and I. She was about 3 at the time. And we had never been to Montana. My husband's an archaeologist. He got a job at the Montana Historical Society as a state archaeologist. And so it was a big adventure for us. It was like packing a covered wagon, kind of, and, you know, setting off into the unknown. We arrived in Helena and had no place to live. The moving van was 3 days behind us. And so we desperately looked for a place that we could move right into. And we looked at everything on the market. Nothing seemed to be right. We finally said to the realtor, isn't there anything else you can show us? And he said, well, there's only one other thing on the market, but, you know, it's kind of big for 3 people, and I don't know if it's anything you'd be interested in. We said, show it to us. So he took us to this house, and it was truly almost as if the house beckoned to us. You know how you go to a place and you really feel like you're home. The house was empty, ready for us to move into. We just knew that it was meant to be. And so, we just knew that it was meant to be, and so we moved right in. The moving van brought our stuff right up to the door, and we've been there ever since. But you know, the first night that I spent in the house, I knew that there was something different about it and something special. I was awakened in the night by the sound of a radio playing. And this radio was kind of between stations. It was very staticky. And sometimes I could hear threads of music, sometimes I could hear talking, but mostly it was static. It was very annoying. I got up, thought, you know, my radio had come on in the night and it was between stations. I went over to the other side of the bed to turn the radio off, but the radio wasn't on. And so I searched around the upstairs trying to locate the source of this radio, and I could never find it. So I went back to bed, lay there for an hour, very annoyed. Finally drifted back to sleep and kind of forgot about it the next morning. But then the next night it happened again. And I didn't say anything about it, but it was very annoying, you know, and I thought, oh, I don't know, maybe I'm dreaming about it or something. But the third night, when it happened again, I began to think that my fillings, you know, were conducting a station, because I've heard of that happening. And when I got up the next morning, I said something to my husband, and he said, oh, have you heard the radio in the night? And I said, oh, thank goodness someone else heard it. I'm not crazy after all. And my daughter said, you know, I've heard it in my room too. So over the course of the next couple of years, we just came to expect that sometimes in the house we'd hear this radio playing. We could never figure out where it came from. We didn't worry about it too much. It was just a quirk of the house, and it was kind of interesting. The elderly gentleman and his sister, who grew up in our house and whose grandparents owned the house before their parents, came to visit us on occasion. And about the third or fourth time they came to visit us, they would tell us these wonderful stories of what it was like to grow up in this 100-year-old house. And finally, this third or fourth visit, we took them upstairs on a tour of the house, and the guy turned to me and he said, you see that bedroom there at the top of the stairs? Back in the 1920s, I had Helena's first radio operation set up in that room. It took up the entire room, and people came from all over Helena just to hear my radio. So we knew at that moment why we hear this radio sometimes in the night, and we still sometimes hear it. And it's just kind of a neat thing about the house. And then after that happened, another thing sort of began to happen in the house. I began to find marbles. Now, I don't know if any of you live in old houses or if any of you have had that experience, but I know a lot of people have told me that they've found marbles in their old houses. And once I give this explanation, then people kind of get creeped out about it. But actually, I think it's kind of neat. One day I was vacuuming my den. I was home by myself, and I came back into the room, and there was this very old marble just sitting in the middle of the floor. I have no idea where it came from. Maybe it rolled out of the baseboards, maybe it fell out of the ceiling. I have no idea. But it was very old, and it was just sitting there, and I collected it, and I thought it was kind of neat. And then we began to find others. We found them on the stairway, again, after I had vacuumed. We found them in the heating returns. We found them in the basement. We found them outside in the garden. And I began to think of those little things as spirit tailings. You know, mine tailings are the piles of dirt that the miners have gone through and cast aside. And I began to think of these little things like the radio in the house and the marbles as little cast-off things from the past that sometimes come to the present to remind us that the past is still important. And so I call those things, and things that we'll be talking about tonight, I call those things spirit tailings. And I think it's a pretty good name for hauntings or whatever you want to call them. Another thing happened in my house also one time. I was cleaning the mirror above the sink in the bathroom that's just off the kitchen, and I had the bathroom door open and I could see the kitchen behind me. And as I cleaned the mirror, I saw a man walk through my kitchen, and I thought it was my husband. The guy had on jeans and a blue shirt, and I thought it was my husband coming home from errands. I ran out into the dining room after him, but there was no one there. And I thought to myself, did I really see that? And what was it? And it was just a very strange experience. And later I heard an explanation that brings home the idea that there are 3 different kinds of ghosts. And I think this is pretty interesting, and maybe it'll give you something to think about later on. The first kind of ghost, I think, has nothing to do with religion. It has nothing to do with what your beliefs may or may not be, but it may be spirits who wander for whatever reason. They may have a message, they may be displaced, whatever. Those are the most unusual kind. But then the second kind is what I call imprints. You know, if someone spends a lot of time in a room sitting in a rocking chair, for example, that might make an impression on the place, like the radio in my house. For some reason, the radio playing in the 1920s made an impression or an imprint on my house. And those things sometimes come back and replay. And they're not necessarily ghosts, they're imprints, they're impressions left by something that happened a long time ago. It doesn't matter whether it's something earth-shaking or, you know, just some common event. But a lot of times I think when people experience things, maybe it's a waft of perfume, you know, or cigar smoke, or something like that, where something has happened that makes an impression. So that's a second kind. And then I think there's a third kind, which I like to think explains what happened when I saw in the mirror this man walking through my kitchen. If you're familiar with Sylvia Browne, who's a renowned psychic, she tells a story to explain this type of incident. Sometimes when people have very intense dreams, maybe it's possible that their essence is teletransported to the place that they're dreaming about. Now, her example is that there was a woman who was having these very, very vivid dreams of a place. She didn't know where the place was, but it was this house, and she knew every little inch of this house. She knew exactly what it looked like outside. She knew all of the rooms and all of the furniture inside, and she kept dreaming about it. And it was driving her crazy, so she began to search the internet to see if she could find this place. And lo and behold, she found a piece of property for sale on the internet that was in England that she was sure was this place. So she took a trip to England. She found this place. She very boldly went up and knocked on the door, and a couple answered the door, and when they saw her, they turned white. And they said, "Oh my God, "You're our ghost." So the woman had been dreaming so intensely about this place that the people living there thought the house was haunted. And I like to think that what I saw in the mirror walking through my house was actually someone who may have lived there before or may have visited me or someone else and was having a very intense dream about walking through my kitchen, and that's what I saw. At least I like to explain it that way. Back to marbles for just a moment. I don't know if you're familiar with the Montana Club in Helena, but there's some very good examples of marbles at the Montana Club. For, maybe 5 years ago or so, I was asked to script a tour of the inside, and so I began to do a lot of research on the building, and I kind of had free reign of the inside. It's a very vast building. It was the current building was built in 1905, designed by renowned architect Cass Gilbert, who also designed the Metals Bank building in Butte. But anyway, this building is very vast, and it's now subdivided kind of into professional condominiums where there are businesses on the middle floors. But at one time it was home to single men or men who came from out of town and needed a place to stay. And it was, fairly high class, very elegant. It's still very elegant today. At any rate, I was standing with Dave Walter, the late Dave Walter, who was a colleague of mine, and the manager of the Montana Club, who was at the time J.N. Roberts, and the three of us were standing on the mezzanine level, and there was this glass case of artifacts from the building. And we were talking about this particular artifact that was a glass vase or vase, and it was like this woman, and the woman's face was the center of it, and then her hair fanned up like she was underwater. It was really ugly. And we began to talk about how ugly this weird vase was. And there was a very, very heavy door, as only Montana Club doors can be, very heavy door, open with a doorstop at my elbow. And as we began to talk about this object, that door slammed shut with such force that it rattled everything in this cabinet. And Jan, the manager, looked at me and Dave, and she said, we better not talk about that vase anymore. This has happened before, so let's just go somewhere else. And so that was one thing that happened. But then down in the basement, the same afternoon, I went down in the basement to explore the corridors. And there is a padlocked doorway. You go up a little flight of stairs, and there's a padlocked doorway that leads to Helena's mythical tunnels. You guys probably have the same kind of tunnels under Missoula. They were used across the West to deliver steam heat at the turn of the 20th century. And we have them in Helena. We have all these stories about how they're Chinese tunnels and this and that, and they're not. They're just delivery for the steam heat. The Montana Club never tapped into that system, but it does have the access, and the door is there, and it's padlocked. Anyway, we were standing there talking about the mythical uses of Helena's tunnels, and I happened to glance down, and there between the juncture of the floor and the wall and the sandy kind of basement-y material, there was a red cat's eye marble. Now you tell me, why would there be a red cat's eye marble in the basement of the Montana Club? So I thought that was pretty strange. I wove it into a story in the first book. And then about 6 months ago, the new manager at the club called me and said, I have a new story for you. And he proceeded to tell me about how they had gone off and locked the building up. There was no one in there overnight. But when they came in the next morning, they found that the elevator had apparently been running on its own because it was stuck between floors. And they couldn't figure out why it was stuck, and they called the elevator repairman, and he came, and he had to go down to the sub basement to the crawl space where the gearbox was housed. And the gearbox was carefully covered with this large dust cover and bolted to the wall. He had to remove the bolts, and as he did that, he found the gearbox stuck in a gear was a marble, holding up that entire elevator. So watch for marbles, if you pick them up in your house, keep them where they belong and don't take them away, because they are little spirit tailings, and they do kind of remind us that the past is still important. Now, there's a guy by the name of Tom Donovan who's an author. I don't know if you have run into him, but he has written a couple of books, and he and I have one thing in common. My director at the Historical Society says that I am the state's keeper of the state's macabre history, which I guess is kind of true. Well, he kind of does the same thing in a different way, and he's written a book about, it's called Dying to Hunt in Montana, all the different hunting accidents where people died. And so he and I were sitting at a book signing one day, and he began to tell me about, you know, his career and the macabre things that he's written about. And he said, well, you know, I have a story that I want to tell you. So he began to tell me this story about something that happened to him when he was in high school. He grew up here in Missoula, and he was an avid hunter even back then. And he and his 3 friends one afternoon, on Friday afternoon, decided at the spur of the moment that they'd go for the weekend and go hunting. And so they threw everything in the car, and they got out of town pretty late, and they drove up into the hills, and it was getting dark. And they decided, you know, that they'd better look for a place to camp. And so it got pretty dark and darker still, and then they finally found what they thought was a suitable place to camp, and they pulled off the road, and they rolled out their bedrolls, and they made a fire, and you know, they talked around for a while, and then they crawled into their sleeping bags and they went to sleep. And at midnight, the 4 of them awakened all at the same time to the sounds of a miner's pick hitting rock. And you know how a pick, when it hits rock, it rings. And the ring was reverberating, and they could hear this miner's pick deep in the earth. And they could hear it, and it was pick, ring, pick, ring. And so they began to talk about it a little bit and whispered, and they decided they would go and see what was going on, if they could find the source of it. And so they took their flashlights and they searched around, and this was a place where there were a lot of mining shafts, and they found a very large shaft, and they thought they could hear the sound coming from this mining shaft, and all the time this sound is going on. And so the 4 of them climbed down into the shaft, and Tom said that the walls were running water. It was very, very wet and slimy at the bottom, but as soon as the 4 of them got to the bottom, the noise stopped. And so they were really freaked out, because this noise had been going on for about 45 minutes, and now it stopped suddenly. And they could see that there were mining tunnels that went in all different directions, and they had no idea which way they should go, and they really didn't want to anyway. So they hightailed it out of the shaft and went back to their bedrolls, got back in their sleeping bags, and kind of talked about it and tried to go to sleep, and they couldn't sleep. And so finally, when it just began to show the first little fingers of dawn, they decided they would pack up and get out of there. So they packed up their bedrolls, and they got all their stuff together, and they threw it in the car, and they went back to check the site just to make sure they hadn't left anything. And it was just now beginning to get light, and they could see that they had actually pulled off of the road just outside the ghost town of Coloma. And further, as they looked at their campsite, they realized that this was where the cemetery had been. And they could see that there were disturbances in the ground where some of the remains had been removed and probably reburied somewhere else. But other places, there were these depressions, you know, as if the graves had sunken in. And they had spread their bedrolls in those depressions and slept in the graves. Now, I don't know if any of you have heard stories about Main Hall. There are a lot of buildings on campus, on your campus, that are supposed to be haunted. But the problem with it is that you never hear specific stories from anyone. By the time the stories filter down, it's like a game of gossip, you know, the original story gets distorted, and finally when you hear it, it's not what it originally was. And so unless you can actually talk to someone who had a first-hand experience, you're never going to get anywhere, you know, with these types of tales. Well, I was fortunate enough to be introduced to a person who actually did have a very interesting experience in Main Hall last fall in 2006. And he's an anthropology student, and his name is David. And he told me that he had a class on the 3rd floor of Main Hall, and it was October. And he was sitting in class, and he decided he needed to quickly excuse himself and run down to the bathroom on the basement level. So he went down to the men's room, And later he was washing his hands at the sink, and he was looking in the mirror, and behind him was the door, and he saw this man come in. He had on a plaid shirt, red plaid shirt, flannel shirt, and he saw the man through the mirror. He saw him come in and go into a stall and heard the door shut. And then David was fiddling with the paper towel dispenser. This is an old building, and the fixtures are old, and he was having trouble getting the towel to come out, so he was shaking it around. And finally he got the towel out, and he realized that he hadn't heard any noise. And it was like he was alone in the room, and he looked over to the stall, and he didn't see any feet. And he thought that was kind of strange. So he went over to the door, and he put his hand on the door, and he shoved it open, and there was no one in there. And he was sure that he saw this person come in, go into the stall, and heard him shut the door. And so it really creeped him out, and he began to tell, a couple of acquaintances, that had happened, and people began to say, oh, Main Hall is haunted. And, oh, sure, sure it is. But he couldn't explain this experience, and so finally, at Halloween time, the Kaiman ran a story about the Tortured Souls investigations. I don't know if you know them, Eric and Chris Bratlin, who go places with their electronic equipment, and they monitor. They try to tape EVPs, and they do videotaping, and they tape activity and that kind of thing. And so they had done an investigation on the campus, and they had set up their equipment in several different buildings, and one of them was Main Hall. And David happened to read this article, and it really creeped him out, because they said that in Main Hall there had been stories about people supposedly had seen a ghost enter this vault, go through the wall. Now there's a vault that is opposite the men's bathroom in the basement. And the different accounts all said that this ghost went through the vault door. And so that's where Tortured Souls decided to set up their equipment. So they happened to set it up down there in the corridor. They carefully shut the bathroom door, and they did in fact record activity in that area. But when they went to pick up their equipment, the bathroom door was open. And so when David read that story, it all kind of coalesced, and he realized that he really had seen something there. And what he describes what he saw in the mirror as he only saw the person from the waist up. But in retrospect and thinking about it, it was kind of fuzzy and blurry, and it didn't really look like a person should look. So I don't know if that, how to explain it, but there may be some ghostly activity going on in Main Hall. Now there's another story. I don't know if you know where the little town of Rivulet, it's just a little stop on the railway. I don't think there's anything now there anymore. I think the railroad tracks have been taken up probably. But at one time in the teens, it was a place where the crews would change on the railroad. And so they would sometimes have a 24-hour layover there. And they would hike up 2 miles up to where there was an abandoned homestead, and they would put out their bedrolls there and spend the night and pass the time. And this abandoned homestead was also a place where hunters would camp out. And so hunters and railwaymen were frequenting this homestead that was abandoned. And in 1915, there were these stories that began about how the railwaymen and the hunters who camped in this abandoned homestead saw an apparition. And what they saw was a woman in a white dress, and everybody described it just a little bit differently. Some people said that this apparition had no head, and others said that she was in a wedding dress. And all of them agreed that this woman was crying piteously, just crying piteously, and the sound was horrible. And so journalists from the Missoulian decided to go up with their cameras and see what they could capture. And sure enough, they also saw the apparition, but they couldn't get a picture of her. And so this was at the time of women's suffrage, and there were stories and there were ballads that were written about her in the newspaper. And because this was the time of women's suffrage, one of the ballads said in part, "O brave men of Montana, we are really surprised at you. If the vision of one woman scares you, oh, what can the suffragists do?" So this went round and round in the Missoulian, and people talked about it and talked about it, and it lasted, the talk about it lasted for decades. It lasted down into the 1960s. Maybe some of you even have heard the stories about it. And Cheryl Stewart, who is a Red Lodge resident today, grew up in Missoula, and she heard these stories about the weeping woman. And one Halloween, she and her brother and her cousins were treated to a surprise when her uncle said to them, "I propose that we go up to the haunted cabin, to the haunted homestead on Halloween, and we, check it out and see if we can see the weeping lady, the weeping woman." So they made a big excursion out of it, and the kids all piled into the car, and the uncle took them up there, and they took the 2-mile hike up to this abandoned homestead, and they played around on the hillside all day and didn't see any signs of the ghost. And then it was just about sunset, and they decided they'd better start back. And as they were preparing to leave, they looked up to the ridge top, and they saw female figures standing up there. They were dressed in white. The white was kind of fluttering in the wind, and they were just watching them, and it scared the kids half to death. And so and the uncle too, and they all hightailed it back to the car, locked the doors, came back to Missoula, sat around the kitchen table and, compared notes, and everybody was really, really scared. Well, the kids were so scared that finally Cheryl's mother came into the room and said, "Okay, so I have a confession to make. Your aunt and I dressed up in white, and we stood up on the ridgetop just to scare you." But then Cheryl got to thinking about it, and she said, "Well, who was the third person?" The uncle and all the kids swore that there weren't just 2 women in white, there were 3. Sometimes, kids will do things that they're not supposed to do. You kids know that. And Jeff Bickenhauser, who grew up in Harlem, Montana, was one of those kids that was told never, ever, ever to play in the abandoned buildings down by the railroad. But as kids will be kids, what do you think they did? They were always hanging out down there. And this one particular evening, Jeff and his friend decided that they were going to investigate the Harlem Hotel. And at that time, there were a number of buildings still standing down by the railroad tracks. Most of those buildings have all been torn down now. But the old Harlem Hotel was standing, and it was a pretty derelict building, and I'm sure that their parents would not have wanted them to venture inside. But it was a summer night, kind of like this one, and along toward dusk, and they made their way down to the old Harlem Hotel, and they decided that they would go inside, and they stepped inside and they saw this long corridor with rooms opening out, and so they decided they'd investigate the rooms, and they looked in the rooms one by one. They didn't find anything of much interest. A couple of abandoned chairs, a broken dresser, a mattress here and there, and some bed springs and that kind of thing, but nothing very interesting. So they got to the end of the corridor, and there was a stairway that went and turned up to the second floor, and they decided to go up and see what was on the second floor. So they walked up the narrow stairs, and they got to the top of the stairs, and again they decided to make a systematic check of all the rooms, and they worked their way down. Nothing was in these rooms at all. They got to the last room, and they peeked in, and sitting in the middle of the floor was a very old wheelchair. And it was one of these kind with a caned back and seat, and it was just sitting there. And they looked at each other, and they thought that was kind of strange, and then they looked at the wheelchair again, and as they looked at it, they noticed that ever so quietly, ever so slowly, the wheels were turning. And it was moving, just very slightly. They could see the spokes turning around. And so they looked at each other, and they were pretty scared, and they took off running down the hallway, and they fell over each other all the way down to the bottom of the stairs and landed in a heap, and they picked themselves up and rushed out the door. And Jeff says that as he got out the doorway, he turned around to look behind him. And there at the bottom of the stairs was the wheelchair, as if it was waiting for them. There's another Missoula story that I don't tell very often because it didn't make it into either of my two books, because my editor said both times this story isn't historical, and so you can't put it in the book. But it's a story that I really like, and I haven't told it in a long time, but because it's a Missoula story, I thought I would tell it to you. And do we still have the dog here? Well, you probably know, and many of you, if you have pets, you know how attached you become, and people form a really important bond with their dogs and their cats. And this story is about that. The family prefers that I don't use a last name, but if I did tell you who it was, you would probably recognize this last name. The woman and her husband were very prominent here in Missoula, and she was quite elderly. Her husband had died. Her name was Frances. And she was in her 80s, middle 80s, and she decided that she needed to have a dog. All her pets had died, her husband had died, and she needed the companionship. She lived by herself in the university area district, and so she had family members take her to the Missoula Humane Society, and she looked at all of the dogs that were there for adoption, and she finally found this one little Shih Tzu that was black and white. And his fur was very soft, and he bounded over to her and kind of cuddled in her lap, and she looked down at his face, and he was missing an eye, but his hair curled over the place where the eye used to be, and he was just very charming. And she looked into the one little shiny black eye that he had remaining there, and she thought she saw in the deep depths of this little black eye hope and promise. And so she said, "What's his name?" And they said, "His name is Arvin." And she said, "I'll take Arvin home." And so she did. And for 5 years, Arvin and Frances were inseparable. And then when Frances turned 91, she was still living by herself, but she was having some trouble getting around. And so her family hired some caregivers to move in to stay with her to make sure that she was okay at night in particular. And as these caregivers moved in and stayed overnight in the house, Arvin began to do something that he'd never done before. He began to howl. He began to howl in the most blood-curdling, unmerciful howl that you have ever heard. People walking by on the street could hear him. The neighbors could hear him. And every half hour, he would let out with this horrible, horrible howling. And it didn't bother Frances too much because she just turned her hearing aid off, you know. But it bothered the caregivers because they couldn't sleep. And so one of their friends suggested that they call this lady named Keek Mensing. I don't know if any of you know her. She lives here in Missoula. She's a professional psychotherapist, and she has in recent years taken a lot of training in animal communication. And she's really, at the time that this incident happened, she was sort of just beginning her career, and she's since really developed that skill. But she's quite a fantastic animal communicator. And anyway, so they called Keek, and they told her what the situation was, and she said she would try to talk to Arvin and see if she could find out why he was doing this horrible howling. And so she, as she does, she took a picture of Arvin, and she held it, and she prepared herself for a mental conversation with him, and she called him, "Arvin, Arvin, Arvin, are you there?" And he answered her and said, "You know, I'm here." And she said, "My name is Keek, and I'd really like to have a conversation with you." And they kind of introduced themselves. And so she had this interesting conversation with Arvin. And Arvin told her that, she said to him, "You know, you're really bothering people howling in the night like this. What's the problem?" And he said, "Well," he said, "we have these caregivers that are coming in, and I'm afraid that they're going to be taking my place. You know, it's my job to watch over Frances, and it's my job to take care of her. And first of all, I'm afraid if they sleep, they're not going to know if there's an emergency. And furthermore, if they stay here, they're going to take over my job, and I'm afraid I'm going to be homeless again, and I'm too old to take care of myself." So Keek assured him that everything was okay, that there were people that cared about him, that he would do everyone a big favor if he would just not howl anymore. So for a month, he stopped. And then he started up again. And so Keek had another conversation with Arvin, and this time he said, you know, in another lifetime, I was hit by a car, and Frances took me in and nursed me back to health, and I owe her this debt. It took me half a lifetime to find her again, and I owe her, you know, but I'm too old to fulfill this debt that I owe, and I just don't know what to do. And so they had a conversation about how it was important for him not to howl, and he said, well, he would try. But then after a little time, he began to howl again, and he also developed medical problems, and they decided that the best thing to do would be to put him to sleep. And so after Keek discovered that Arvin had died, she thought it would be a good idea to try to contact him and see how he felt about the human's decision to put him to sleep. She'd never tried to do this before, and she wondered if she could. But she tried. She took his picture, and she thought about him, and she said, Arvin, 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 are you there? And he answered her, I'm here. Keek said, how are you? Is everything okay? How do you feel about this decision? He said, I tried to hang on for Frances, but I realize now that I couldn't, and she has her own path to follow, and she'll be okay. And Keek said, well, how about you? Are you all right? And he said to her, the freedom of the soul is a beautiful thing, and I have my eye back, and I can see. Let's see here. One of my favorite stories, I don't know if any of you have ever visited the Dumas in Butte. I'll have to make this not X-rated. Anyone visited the Dumas? You have? Okay. Oh. Oh. He fell down. Okay. Oh, sorry. I wasn't paying any attention. So the Dumas Hotel in Butte is in grave danger of being demolished. The back wall has collapsed. It's one of these really important historic landmarks because it was in operation from 1890 until 1981. And I won't be too specific, you guys can get my drift. And it is this wonderful social archive because the building itself is a history lesson in historical layers. The top floor reflects the high-rolling 1890s when Copper Kings had all this money to burn, and they would have parties in the suites upstairs, and each suite today remains in its pristine condition with a transom, numbered transom over the doorway and a corner sink in each room. And on the first floor, there were these beautiful pocket doors that shut to enclose the parlors, but when you open them up, it made this grand ballroom space where they would have soirees, staged soirees and that kind of thing. And once the Copper Kings left, this became, you can almost read the economy, Butte's economy, as it changed, and the clientele changed from, you know, wealthy men to miners and blue-collar workers and laborers. And the thing that you'll notice when you first walk into the building is that the ground floor is very gaudy with red-orange woodwork and orange shag carpeting and a payphone, which is really out of character with its Victorian roots, you know, but it's very interesting because those layers are all important. But in the basement, there's a different story there. 10-minute timers clocked $1 a minute as the women worked in these rooms, and the air down there is stale, and it makes your skin crawl. And at night, the building is a scary place. They say that ghosts wander the 43 rooms, upstairs, downstairs, in the pockets of darkness. They float and they glide. Well, the Dumas has a long history, and some of the history is not so happy. Most of it's not so happy. In 1950, the madam there was Eleanor Knott, and Eleanor Knott was ready to leave the business. She had a married lover who was going to come for her. Her suitcase was packed. She was ready to leave, start a new life. And so she was in her room, waiting at the window, watching to see if when he would come, and she waited and waited and waited, and he never showed up. And so the next morning, her friends found her dead of an overdose of sleeping pills laced with alcohol. And there was no inquest. It was ruled a suicide. But her friends always wondered because she had a red Cadillac, a brand new Harley Davidson motorcycle, a lot of cash, and some very valuable jewelry that never showed up. So the implication was that it wasn't suicide. Someone wanted her out of the way. I can tell you that even last week someone called me and said, you know, I wondered if the Dumas is haunted. I'm from out of town and I was driving by there and I saw this woman standing up at the window. And I know the building is closed, but I saw this woman standing there and she had this hat on. And I often get people calling me, asking me if the building is haunted because they see this woman in the window. Well, in the 1990s, Rudy Getzik, who is now the owner of the building, had an antique mall in the building. And he periodically would get visits from some of the women that worked there. And one day, a woman who worked in the 1970s for Ruby Garrett, who was the last madam there, came in and they kind of struck up a conversation. And she told him of a very odd experience that she had. When she was working in the building, she was there one night by herself. She was living in one of the upstairs suites. And she was actually sitting in the bathroom, and the door was open. No one else in the building. The doors were barred and locked shut. And she was sitting there, and she heard footsteps coming down the hallway. And they came closer and closer, and then she saw this woman pass by the doorway. The woman had a short-brimmed hat on, and she was carrying a suitcase. And she was so shocked, she didn't know what to do. She couldn't get her wits about her. And she saw the woman saw her head disappear down the stairway. So she ran after her as soon as she collected herself. And when she got to the bottom of the stairs, there was no one there. No one could have gotten in or out. And so that was an interesting experience. And not too long after that, there was a visiting artist who was paid by the city of Butte to paint a mural. And she needed a studio. And so Rudy offered her the madam's apartment. And because it is a great place to work, there's these wonderful bay windows that are very tall and the light comes in there just beautifully. So he offered her this madam's apartment, and she moved her equipment in, set up her easel, but every time she faced the canvas, she painted not the mural she was supposed to paint, but a face, the same face, over and over and over and over again. And it was a face of a 40-ish woman with a short-brimmed hat and a very coy smile. So we wonder if this woman is Eleanor Knott. Rudy rescued one of the canvases from the trash, and there's a picture of it in the book if you want to look at it. We wonder if this is Eleanor Knott, but you know, she has this very coy smile, and it's obvious that we'll never know, only she knows the answer to the question. So as long as the Dumas stands on Mercury Street in Butte, ghosts will roam its 43 rooms, upstairs, downstairs, in the pockets of darkness. They wait there, keeping their vigil, keeping its secrets. Let's see. So you probably heard about the Flathead Monster, have you not? Everybody heard about the Flathead Monster. Do you believe it? See? The Flathead Monster doesn't get enough credit, I don't think. Even Dorothy Johnson, who's a very well-known author, wrote a letter to the editor in the Whitefish paper and said, don't talk about the Flathead Monster tongue-in-cheek because it's not a joke. And she firmly believed that there was something to it. Now, the first sighting of the Flathead Monster happened in 1887 when Captain James Kerr was piloting this steamboat across Flathead Lake. He had a whole boatload of passengers, and everyone was out on the deck, and they were all looking ahead, and they saw directly in front of them this thing swimming toward them. It looked like a log, but it was moving. Some joker in the crowd pulled a gun and shot at it, scared everybody half to death, and the thing dived and never surfaced again. That was the first recorded sighting. And since that time, there have been at least 100 recorded sightings of the flathead monster. Now, Fish, Wildlife, and Parks maintenance guys, sometimes up there, are called to dispose of things. And they were called one day over to Wild Horse Island to dispose of a dead horse. This dead horse was stiff as a board. And usually when they dispose of this kind of thing, they use dynamite just to get rid of it. But there was a nearby cabin, and so they couldn't dynamite it. And so they talked about what they might do to dispose of it, and they decided that the best way would be to build a raft using inner tubes and boards on top, and then they would lash the horse to the boards. So they went over to the island in their boat, and they built this raft, and they lashed the dead horse, making a bit of a stink, to the boards with his feet sticking straight up in the air. But they kind of miscalculated the weight of the horse, and so when they put it in the water, it sunk a little bit, and just the 4 feet were sticking out. And so they made their way across the lake, dragging this strange cargo. And you can imagine all the boats for all around the lake, were coming over there wanting to know what it was. And one guy was pretty bold, and he drove his boat up close and said, "Hey guys, what are you doing?" They got out their bullhorn and they said, "This is official business, stay away." But the guy persisted, and he got a little bit closer, and he goes, "No, but really, what are you guys doing?" And finally, Murray Phillips, who was the maintenance supervisor, turned to him, and what he told him was priceless. The look on the guy's face was priceless. He said to him, "We're trolling for the Flathead Lake monster." And I'll tell you, the interesting thing about it is that in looking at the Indian cultures around in that area, the Kootenai Indians, for generations and generations and generations, had a name for Flathead Lake, and it translates as Monster Lake. That's true. Okay. Well, one last story, and this is probably the premier ghost story, Montana's premier ghost story. It's interesting that the vigilantes hanged some 24 people in the space of about less than 6 weeks. And we don't have any stories of the ghosts of those victims walking the streets of Bannock or walking the streets of Virginia City, which I think is interesting. The only ghost story that has come down to us from that time period is not about a vigilante victim, it's about the wife of one of the vigilante victims. And this is the story of Virginia Slade. Now, Jack Slade and his wife, Virginia, rode into the streets of Virginia City in the fall of 1863, and they cut impressive figures on their thoroughbred horses. Jack was riding Old Copper Bottom, and Virginia was riding her black stallion named Billy Bay. And actually Billy Bay was acquired from Malcolm Clark, the trader, who acquired it from the Blackfeet Indians who stole him from the Great Salt Lake area and brought him up. But even by the time Virginia Slade acquired him, he had really earned a reputation as a great racing horse. And so she cut quite a figure on this horse. She was rather full-figured and large woman. She had this raven hair. And she was an expert seamstress, made all of her own clothes. If anyone was fortunate enough to be invited up to the Meadow Valley where they kept the toll house for people coming down the Bozeman Road up there for dinner, they were treated to a beautiful setting with linens, silver, and crystal. And she was an expert cook, too. And people in the community really respected Virginia. She may have had a rather shady reputation, but they respected her skills. She shone like a diamond among these rather homespun settlers. And so people respected Virginia. They didn't like her husband too much, though. And Jack Slade was really a kind of Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde type character. When he was sober, he was a pretty nice guy, but when he was drunk, he was dangerous. He would ride his horses into the storefronts, just like in the movies, and create disturbances and break things and ruin merchandise. He'd take his gun out and shoot it in the street and scatter the children, and parents were terrified of him. And the last straw came when Jack Slade decided to harass the local milkman. There was only a couple of cows in the territory at this time and not very many children. But the milk supply was very, very precious to the community. And so he decided to begin to harass this milkman and began to chase him, and the milk wagon overturned and the supply of milk went spilling down the hillside. And so parents decided something had to happen with Jack Slade. Now, he went around bragging about all the people that he'd killed. He never killed anyone in Montana. But before he came to Montana Territory, he had 25 notches on his gun. He claimed he killed all these people. He also kept in his pocket the dried up, shriveled ears of one of the victims. Supposedly this guy had shot Jack, and in retaliation, Jack hunted him down and filled him full of lead, but in places that wouldn't kill him. And then he sliced off his ears and showed them to him as the guy's eyes glazed over for the last time. And he kept these ears in his pockets. And whenever he didn't have money for whiskey, he'd pull them out and put them on the bar for collateral. Well, this was the last straw. So the vigilantes had a meeting and they decided they had to do something about Jack Slade. It wouldn't do to just banish him. They had to eliminate him. So they arrested him. They had a kind of a mock trial. They decided that he needed to be executed. They marched him down to behind Rank's drugstore, where Rank's drugstore is today. There was a corral there, and they threw the noose over the top of a corral gate and put him up on a dry goods box and put the rope around his neck. And they kind of stood around wondering if they should really do it. And they began to talk, and one of them says, you know, somebody's going to ride out to the Meadow Valley and warn Virginia. So if we're going to do this, we'd better do it now. And so the executioner kicked the dry goods box out from under Jack Slade, and he swung into eternity, and as he did, they began to hear hoofbeats up the hill. And pretty soon those hoofbeats got louder and louder. And this was March. There was snow on the ground. And in a big swirl of snow emerged the form of Virginia Slade on her black stallion, Billy Bay. Her raven hair was loose. Her skirts were billowing out behind her. And she was screaming at the tops of her lungs, and she was brandishing this revolver. And she came thundering down into the corral, but she was too late. And she was furious. You never heard such venom come out of a woman. She said she would never bury her husband in a place like this, where people had treated him thus. So she bought a lead-lined coffin. She filled it with the whiskey that had been her husband's undoing, took it back up to the Meadow Valley and kept it there until the roads were thawed, and she took him to Salt Lake City for burial. For whatever reason, she came back to Virginia City soon after that, rented a house in town, and began to run a millinery shop. Well, Jim Kiskadden, who was a friend of her husband's, began to court her, and pretty soon they were married, and they rode off into the sunset to Salt Lake City to make a new life for themselves. But Jim Kiskadden soon learned that only the devil himself could live with Virginia Slade and her temper, and they were divorced. And no one knows exactly what happened to Virginia Slade after that. But if you talk to old-timers in Virginia City, they'll tell you that sometimes when the shadows are just right and the moon is on the wane and the purple shadows are creeping down the hillside, if you listen really hard, sometimes you can hear those hoofbeats pounding down the hill. They come closer and closer. Sometimes you can catch a glimpse of the ghostly form of Virginia Slade on her black stallion, Billy Bay. Billy Bay is flecked with foam, and her skirts are billowing out behind her, and her raven hair is loose, and she's screaming at the very tops of her lungs. And her cries echo through the valley to the very tops of the Tobacco Root Mountains. Thank you all for coming. If you have questions or comments, I'd be glad to, or stories.
Do you know about the ghost at Chico Hot Springs?
Mm-hmm. I do. Percy Knowles. Mm-hmm. I do know about. Have you ever seen her?
No, we go there regularly. I mean, every year.
A lot of people have had experiences there. I know.
For years, we purposely didn't go to the third floor because our kids found out about the ghost.
Yeah, yeah. A lot of people have seen that rocking chair moving back and forth. I know someone who actually saw by the vending machines the upper torso of a little girl. And then there's, yeah, there are quite a few stories. Yeah, it's an interesting place. Anybody else? Well, I have a few books with me here tonight if anyone's interested. I also have Historical Society catalogs, and you can take those and you can order the book. I don't know if they still carry it around here in Missoula at the bookstores. They probably do. So, thank you all.
Thank you.